Ask an MS Expert Veterans Program. My name is Emily Riley, and I'm the new moderator for this wonderful program. I'm a proud Air Force wife. As you can tell, I'm in my husband's office. I'm a dog mom. I'm a certified personal trainer who teaches adaptive fitness classes for the MS community, and I've been living with MS for over 16 years. I am located in Alexandria, Virginia, and currently work for the National MS Society as the local healthcare provider engagement manager. Thank you so much for joining us. The National MS Society is committed to offering a place to connect and ask questions to MS experts on topics impacting veterans affected by MS. We'll also highlight important resources and services available through the VA. MS Navigators are online throughout the program, answering questions and providing resources, so please post any questions or comments you may have in the comments box on YouTube. Today, we will be talking about anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. Almost 1/3 of adults will experience some form of distressing anxiety at some point in their lifetime. It's important for everyone to know that you're not alone in experiencing these common symptoms, and there are things you can do to effectively manage them. This month, we observe mental health awareness. It's important to do our part to raise awareness, reduce the stigma, and share resources and support that are available for people and families affected by mental illness. Later this month, we will observe Memorial Day, a day we will remember, mourn, and honor those who died while serving in the U.S. military. We recognize this day can be especially challenging for veterans living with post-traumatic stress disorder. The National MS Society and the Veterans Health Administration are here to support you, and PTSD resources will be provided during this program. Now, let's meet our experts for today. Dr. Stephen Erickson is a licensed clinical neuropsychologist at Greenville Veterans Affairs Health Center in North Carolina. Dr. Erickson has an interest in the interaction of medical and neurologic disorders with psychiatric conditions and works with adult and geriatric veterans. Lisa Lynn is a private practitioner and owner of Dove Wellness and Counseling, LLC. Lisa is a military veteran and has experience working with veterans in several treatment settings, including inpatient, outpatient, and community levels of care. So first, I'd like to ask Dr. Erickson to join me on camera. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So let's start our conversation talking about anxiety. Anxiety disorders are 3 times more common in people in MS than in the general population. So can you describe anxiety, including some of the most common symptoms?
Sure. So probably the easiest way to understand anxiety is to compare it with what it's not. And so the contrast between fear and anxiety is helpful. So for example, in clinical psych, fear is it's imminent danger, it's unambiguous, it's obvious, it's right in front of you. It's an event or a stimulus that requires an immediate response. And it's in the present, and it's very specific. And so that's contrasted with anxiety. Now, anxiety is different. Instead of being obvious and right in front of your face, it's something in the future. And it's off sometime that may or may not happen. And so there's actually a level of ambiguity to it. And sort of the key elements of anxiety are unpredictability and lack of control. And the difference is that whereas fear tends to last a short amount of time, anxiety can persist for indefinitely, right? I mean, you can be anxious about a test coming up next week, a public speaking engagement 2 months from now, or something that happens in 30 years, which causes a lot of opportunity for difficulty with coping with that. So those are the 2 big things. And so that anxiety has strategies that often involve avoidance and often entail vigilance, because you have to constantly be on guard. So fear is in the present, it's very specific and obvious, and anxiety is more diffuse, it's more intellectual, it's future oriented. And that's what anxiety is best conceptualized as.
Let's see. So what are the most common types of anxiety disorders?
So the most common anxiety disorders, so sort of the core anxiety disorder is generalized anxiety. And it's just what it sounds like. It's generalized. It's the person sort of is soaking in a low level or fairly high level of anxious arousal all the time. It's very unpleasant. It's very much in the body. The person has a tough time relaxing. It's very physiological. And the person tends to ask a lot of what if questions that are catastrophic in nature. What if this terrible thing happens? What if that terrible thing happens? And what usually is the case is that the person moves from one catastrophe to another, or maybe they rotate, amongst a certain, sort of limited set of worries. And so the problem there is really worry or controlling it. Whereas, for example, with like panic disorder, it's closer to fear because it's got this very fight or flight response in the here and now. The person hyperventilates, that sort of thing. Social anxiety is another big one. That's where the fear is being evaluated by others. Phobias are closer to fears, and that's like, fear of heights, fear of spiders. PTSD, as you can sort of tell, has fear and anxiety-based elements, right? So the fear-based element is the actual cue, the things that reminds the person of the trauma, and the anxiety is a whole host of things where they're, sort of anticipatory dread about what might happen or what happens. Will they be safe? Are they in a safe environment? That sort of thing. And of course, in PTSD, hypervigilance is a central characteristic, right? Where the person is always on guard, can't let their guard down, that sort of thing. Other anxiety disorders are like OCD, that kind of thing. And anxiety, not only does it show up in like, true anxiety disorders, but it's also a feature of depression, addictions, and other disorders too. So those are some of the basic anxiety disorders. And so technically, I just want to add, PTSD used to be considered an anxiety disorder, but now it's actually moved into its own category of trauma-related disorders, but it's very related for the reasons I just said.
Okay. So we heard from Kate, who's a veteran, and she's living with MS. Kate wants to know if this combination makes her more likely to experience anxiety.
It does. I mean, so the statistics show that if you look at the rates of anxiety and depression in individuals with MS versus those who don't, their rates are higher. Now, I was reviewing the research before this, and I saw consistently that the rates were approximately about 30%, so give or take, so like between 20 to 50%, 20 to 40. So it's about 2 to 3 times what you normally see in the regular population.
Yeah. And I know like a lot of us maybe have experienced some type of anxiety like you explained earlier in our lives, but how does someone know when it's time to get professional help? And if like, what are the risks if somebody doesn't get help?
So it's time to get help. I mean, it's time to get help, in 2 basic circumstances. So if there's distress, right? If a person is distressed, if they're really upset, and the distress will manifest in multiple settings, or impairment. So you can have distress and or impairment. So if there's impairment, if it's affecting your relationships, if it's affecting your enjoyment of life, your quality of life, it's affecting your work, your parenting, it can occur across all sorts of settings. But really, if the person is unhappy and is experiencing that distress and or it's affecting these other settings, that's definitely a sign that you should get it looked at.
That's really helpful. And what are the risks if somebody doesn't get help?
Well, there's a lot of risks, right? So, I mean, one of the themes that will be sort of recurring in this presentation is how everything is systemic. Mm-hmm. And if a veteran doesn't get treatment, first of all, of course, the person just is miserable, they're unhappy, they're just living in this very distressing state. That's no good in and of itself. But of course, we're all part of a system, so that affects the relationships, spouses, extended family, children, the community, friends, etc. And what we'll see is that, these mood effects, the anxiety, the depression, etc., affects the body, and therefore affects the symptoms of MS, even to the point of affecting imaging. And so you have this sort of reciprocal relationship where, if you don't take care of your health or your anxiety or depression, your MS can actually be accelerated in its course, which of course puts more caregiver burden. And you can see how this will pinball back and forth, really making it harder across the board. So, and that's not to even speak of, for example, increased rates of, potential self-harm or that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Now that leads into the next topic, just so that how MS can cause significant anxiety, distress, and anger and frustration, really from the moment of our first symptoms. And that uncertainty and unpredictability associated with MS is one of the most distressing, aspects of living with MS on a daily basis. So is anxiety a reaction to having MS, or is it caused by changes in the brain? You mentioned changes in the MRI, so I was just curious.
Yep. Yeah, so this is the probably the single most important insight that I found in all the research was that mind and body are interconnected. So an older way of framing things, some decades ago would have been, well, a person has a physical illness, and so they're of course understandably depressed in reaction to it. And so the illness is the cause that leads to the problems with anxiety as an effect. But now we know better. Now we know it's more of a wheel, right, that sort of flows back and around where mind and body are interconnected. And so what we see is that, there was a study just a few years ago in 2017 where anxiety, the anxiety a person was experiencing actually predicted the onset, the relapse of the MS symptoms, which is a very big deal because that means that, these paper and pencil scales or just self-report actually predicted radiological findings. And so you see that on imaging, you see the lesions and so forth, and it's actually predictive. And then of course, that causes, distress over that as well. And so it tends to feed into itself if there's not intervention, right? Yes. So we see it as both cause and effect. And it's this very complex relationship. And separating those relationships is a challenge, but there are jumps that are being made, and it's an exciting time.
Yeah. So does an MRI look different for someone who's experiencing anxiety?
It does. I mean, we have to be careful. So first of all, as a neuropsychologist, every day I review imaging. And although I'm not a neuroradiologist, I am familiar with the basics. And what you see is, so first of all, there is the counterintuitive finding that a lot of times the relationship between everyday behavior and performance is looser than you would expect with imaging. So you can see imaging findings that don't always correlate perfectly with everyday behavior. But having that been said, like I said, there was that one study with a good sample size that showed that it did, in fact, predict relapse. At the very moment of relapse, anxiety, and in fact, it was actually specific to anxiety, not depression, but anxiety actually predicted the radiologic findings. So you can see it, but I just want to avoid the impression that you can look at someone with MS who has anxiety with someone who doesn't, and you can tell the difference. Now that you can't do, those studies haven't been done, but there are strong correlations that are suggestive, and those are being followed up on in current research.
Interesting. It just kind of shows the impact that anxiety can have on our MS. I know we'll talk a little bit more later about ways to help manage that. Earlier you kind of touched a little bit on PTSD, so we'll turn our focus to post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. Can you explain what PTSD and what symptoms someone might experience?
Sure. So, PTSD, the diagnosis was formally created in about 1980. It had been actually gone by different names since the 1860s, actually, when people were in railroad accidents and they started having these symptoms. And so I can't remember the name they called for it. It's a little esoteric, but, we all are familiar with how in World War I, it was called shell shock and so forth. But the current iteration of PTSD in the diagnostic manual, it's basically centers around single event traumas. So these are, life-threatening or potentially life-threatening, but the research really has expanded. And so it's not just life-threatening, it's also witnessing domestic violence, being part of domestic violence. There's even discussion in terms of diversity issues, in terms of like a racial trauma due to, sustained systemic racism. So I do want to bring that up, that the idea of repeated exposure or chronic stress is probably coming down the road, but for now it remains a single event focus. And this is no small fact, because I just read a study today that said the slight shift in definitions by PTSD from the previous diagnostic manual to the current changed the number of diagnoses by 50%. So it does matter. It's not trivial. But basically, getting to your question, the basic idea is you have this traumatic event, and the traumatic event is not processed. It's overwhelming. And because it is overwhelming, basically the brain tries to re-experience, to come to terms with, to incorporate the trauma. And some of those unincorporated, unintegrated things are thoughts, memories, emotions, nightmares, and most severely flashbacks, where you're actually reliving the past as if it were present. So you have these re-experiencing phenomena, which are unique, fairly unique to PTSD, and help differentiate it diagnostically. And then the reaction to this is avoidance. And the person avoids traumas, cues, people, places, things, that sort of thing. And it leads to alterations in thinking, it leads to alterations in mood. And the person, a lot of times, has a different sense of themselves, the world. I can't trust people. People are no good. I mean, it's a very metaphysical, almost global sort of critique of existence itself. It's very dramatic in some cases. It can also have something called moral injury, where a person, their conscience is injured. So the basic idea is that there's a trauma, and then there's this reaction to it that's maladaptive. And that's what PTSD is in a nutshell.
Okay. And it sounds like maybe something sort of triggers something.
Yeah, right. So because the thing that's unique about PTSD is that, unlike, say, depression or anxiety, which can have no obvious precipitant, sometimes it does, but not always, PTSD in theory should have a specific trigger. And because of that, the sensory and emotional qualities of that trigger are cues, and the brain overgeneralizes, and those specific cues, sounds, gunshots, cars that sound like gunshots, sounds, colors, people, tones of voice. I had one person actually say it was eyebrows. The person reminded them of their abuser. So these things are all cues that then trigger the stress response. You go into fight or flight. And it's this very, you have this very physiological response. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times it's coupled with avoidance of those triggers. And at the brain level, psychologically, avoidance perpetuates the trauma, but actually at the level of the brain, you can actually see the fear center of the brain strengthening and getting stronger. And at the same time that the fear center is actually strengthening its associations, the frontal lobes, which is where you have your decisions to say, I want to do this or that. I don't want to act on this. I don't want to act in an appropriate way, that sort of thing. That actually simultaneously gets a little bit weaker by a tiny amount. And sustained avoidance over time, really, you can see it with a microscope, you can see how trauma, if avoided, is sort of a self-defeating approach to coping.
Well, I know Jerry wrote in and he said that he was on active duty in Afghanistan several years ago, and he still has trouble falling asleep when he does sleep, he usually wakes up with night terrors, sort of like what you mentioned, or sweats. This kind of comes and goes, so it's not happening all the time. So could Jerry have PTSD?
It could be. I mean, one of the challenges with psychology, with diagnosis, is that it's very nonspecific. So, for example, a person goes to a doctor and they say, I have a cough, and the doctor says, well, you have COVID. I mean, that's not true, right? That's not accurate. Why? Because a million things could cause a cough. What if they were just in a dust storm or windy? What if they, drank too quickly and it went down the throat? What if they have tuberculosis, et cetera, et cetera? So there are many ways to have one symptom. And in psychology, this is the same issue, where a person might have sleep issues, right? And you could say, well, that's a sign of, say, physiological or autonomic reactivity increased, right? Which goes hand in hand with trauma, but it also can go with many other things, ADHD, with depression, with just heightened stress. So the issue is that it could be, but what the vignette doesn't describe is whether, this person also has the re-experiencing, the avoidance. And so, of course, that's the natural segue to a professional, assessing whether there is really the presence of all those things, because a lot of those symptoms are non-specific.
Yeah. So, is there some sort of a screening available for someone to sort of maybe test themselves to know, like, oh, maybe I do have this, maybe I should seek out some help?
There are screening items, okay? There are screening measures, and I would recommend that a person does not give them to themselves. First of all, just very briefly, so the short answer is I would not really say there are any good screening items. And the reason is because people have very different frameworks, right? So I see veterans, I see geriatric veterans, and every single week this happens. I'll have a 75-year-old veteran who grew up in rural North Carolina. And what you can't do is say, were you abused, right? You can't say that, because they'll say, of course not. But if you say behaviorally, well, were you ever struck as a child? Oh yeah, my dad used to whoop me all the time. My mom would make me pick out the switch and my dad would hit me with it. And then they would say, and I deserved it. I deserved it. I wasn't abused. It made me the man I am today. Well, I mean, in one sense, it's helpful. It's protective against abuse, or I'm sorry, it's protective against trauma that they framed it that way, right? But at the same time, the very same people who said that it made them good for them, those same people will have lifelong problems with low self-esteem and anger and impulse control. And so even though they don't see it, it's still there in some way, right? And so that's one of the possible ways that self-screening can go wrong, because people interpret behaviors in all sorts of ways, and you really need like training and exposure to the varieties of this so that you can meaningfully parse the different things. And also, some people might overdiagnose, some people might underdiagnose, I mean, there's all sorts of issues. So really the best thing is not to diagnose through internet, is to actually do it with a professional.
So how does someone know whether their symptoms are serious enough to talk to a doctor?
Well, that comes back to my earlier point about distress or impairment, right? I mean, I was working with a veteran a few months ago, and he was referred to me by a psychiatrist. He said he was having memory problems. And when I tested him, he did pretty well. His memory was good. His attention was good. And then I gave him some psychological measures because I had a feeling he was minimizing. And those are very good measures, and they came out pretty good. But the whole point was that the interview was critical, because what I realized was that he was doing pretty well because he was avoiding, because of the behavioral avoidance. And so as a result, someone can look good if they are, really avoiding a lot. So sometimes it can be masked, right? But other times, but usually people have a sense that something is off. If you're doing well, but only when you're in a cocoon and you're avoiding friends and family, you won't go in public, it comes at a high price. And so if a person sees that distress or impairment, right, the impairment is they can't work, they can't drive their kid to school, they can't go out to dinner without sitting at the back of a restaurant, scanning the front door, that sort of stuff, without feeling angry or on edge, or having an argument where they, jump all over or get in someone's face. I mean, those are some of the flags, right? So it comes back to the same thing: distress or impairment, or the costs of not having the distress or impairment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. Now, service members, they've been on missions where they've maybe been exposed to some horrible, life-threatening experiences like Jerry. So does this mean that veterans are more at risk to develop PTSD than non-veterans?
Certain, there are different types of PTSD, right? There's, can have PTSD, say, due to natural disasters. You can have it due to an illness, which we'll probably talk about. You can also have it, such as MS, of course. You can also have combat or blast related. All of these things, there are certain traumas or events that veterans are, of course, routinely exposed to that civilians aren't. And there is a difference. I mean, the rates of spontaneous remission do differ because they are different types of trauma. But I do want to say, though, and I actually heard your quote earlier, but I think it was like 30%. But I actually saw in the National Trauma Center that 50% of adults are exposed to a trauma at some point in their life. And I do want to point out, though, that just because you experience a trauma, that does not mean that you have PTSD, because it's actually the opposite. The majority of people who are exposed to trauma do not experience or have symptoms of PTSD, but there's a good chunk that do. And veterans are more at risk for like certain types, of course, because the unique nature, the chronicity, right? Wartime, high stress, on alert, et cetera, et cetera. So they are more at risk for certain types for sure.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about PTSD and how it may affect MS. So a recent study was conducted that looked at charts of 96 veterans who had MS and PTSD, and then 95 veterans who had MS alone. And the research found that MS relapse rate, disease activity on MRI scans, and disability progression all were increased in people with PTSD. So does the research community know why or how PTSD may increase relapse rate, disease activity, and disability progression?
So the short answer is no.
Okay.
Now, the neurobiology of PTSD is one of my interests, and I actually corresponded with one of the leading researchers at Duke, and the models that I learned just 10 years ago apparently are not as robust. I mean, the core learning, the core deficit in PTSD is learning. It's an association, right? It's fear conditioning, it's Pavlovian, where the person associates the trauma with danger, and then they overgeneralize the association, and then there's all these autonomic responses in reference to it. Now, that much is clear, but in terms of the relationship between, say, PTSD and MS, not really. I haven't seen a whole lot of studies on the intersection of PTSD and MS yet. I think that that's starting.
So how do you think clinical care for people with MS and PTSD may change based on these findings from this research?
Well, I think if you put all these findings together, I think one of the most important takeaways is early intervention, right? So by intervening early, what you're doing is you're lowering the stress level, you're doing it systemically for the person, for all the relationships in their life, and that will lower their stress over time, because we know from the other points we've made in this presentation that stress can be chronic, and chronic stress will exacerbate and accelerate the course of MS. So for multiple reasons, really, early intervention is one of the natural results or follow-ups from this point.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing such valuable information with us on anxiety and PTSD. We will see you a little bit later in the program. And so now I'd like to invite Lisa to join me on camera.
There you go. Hi there.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So Dr. Erickson talked a little bit about PTSD and anxiety, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe treatment and management strategies. So living with MS, anxiety, and PTSD can be really challenging. So let's talk about how all of this affects someone's emotional state and how to manage and treat these conditions. So what are some non-pharmacological strategies that people can use to manage anxiety and PTSD? And are the strategies the same, or are they different, if you want to kind of differentiate between those two?
I think like they're the same and different. There's a lot of overlap, but there has been so much research in trauma treatment and the symptoms, and it's an ever evolving study, just like Dr. Steve just said. And, we know more today than we did 30 years ago with the improvement of technology, even just Western medicine. We have not been about self-regulation. And so, part of like, even as when we're children, reading, writing, and arithmetic should include regulation. So, and I'm saying that too, as a former teacher. So some of the things I want to mention that are the non-pharmacological, non-conventional, instead of always going to a medication, which was more of the conventional model, but really helping to empower people and to tag team, too, with what Dr. Stephen had mentioned, is that avoidance doesn't help heal at all. It actually can exacerbate the symptoms. So some of the interventions that I use with clients, I want to, help them to activate their brain. I want them to pay attention to their internal world. I want them to pay attention to their movements, to their breathing, to their thoughts and their mood patterns, and how all of that, impacts their thinking. So some of those, acupuncture. I mean, that's been a complementary medicine that, involves the skin tissues and prickling them to alleviate pain and to treat various physical, mental, and, emotional conditions. Neurofeedback. I mean, today they know more and more with neurofeedback that they can actually harvest brain waves by putting electrodes on the skull, and they can project those on a computer, and people can play computer games and reorganize their brain waves. So that's been proving body of research. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, something that I do. I just really help people reframe their story, give their story new meaning, restore value, hope, and identify and create a sense of safety within themselves. So often people who have been through a traumatic event feel as though, and have reported to me, they feel weak, or, they somehow contributed to, and actually they don't realize how courageous they are. And, one of my goals is to really reframe their story for them, not to just survive, but to thrive, and to help them recognize something that happened in the past. And you're here telling me today about it 6, 10, 15, 20 years later. You're more than a survivor. And if you've only been surviving, let's take it to the next level so you can thrive. So that's really important. And that happens as a result of a very trained professional in CBT. EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, uses bilateral stimulation while clients recall the event to help rewire sensations related to the event. New on the frontier, I'm very proud to say, is accelerated resolution therapy. I am ART certified. It is also utilizes bilateral stimulation with eye movements that remove negative sensations while the client instills positive images. What's phenomenal about that is there's no talk required. Like as in CBT, people are talking, but people own their script, and they see their script in their mind, and they do visual imagery replacement while they're using bilateral stimulation, while they're out processing negative sensations and in processing positive sensations as a result of changing their script. So that's been very, very powerful. Then, of course, we have yoga. And if you read the body of research on yoga, what's been really interesting is they have found that it has proven to be more effective than the traditional psychotropic medication regimen. Wow. So that's very interesting in the mind and body intervention. Dancing. I mean, dancing alone, Pandora in your living room, turning on the 80s, turning on the hits. That's really good mind-body integration, processing, singing, music, chanting, with others, like in places of worship or their support groups. There's a sense of community in processing trauma, and you can't process trauma alone. So if you're not in the presence of a trained professional and you can be in a communal group, those types of things, great mind-body connection. Meditation, very good. Requires a lot of work and trauma in order to really sit still with a traumatic event. Because sometimes when we talk about triggers, we're not only talking about external triggers, but and even just physiologically and neurologically in the body, but memories can be triggers. So what I like, my greatest go-to with my clients is teaching them how to be still while they are in motion. So I believe that sweat is medicine. I tell them, listen, come here today, put your sneakers on. We're going to sweat. We're going to process this thing out. We can walk, talk, jog. When you get those happy endorphins and those neurotransmitters going, and they can sit down and they're just in a much better fighting position to process what we're going to talk about. It improves their mood. It reduces their stress. Things aren't so scary anymore. Part of that, and I've got to put my plug in here, is I've been writing for MS for 14 years. So this is my 14th year doing Cycle to the Shore. Great mind and body connection. I have met heroes, people afflicted with MS along the way who have become my heroes. So I invite anybody watching this video, join us out there. It will be fantastic. Look up my name. I'd love to introduce you to these phenomenal heroes I ride with.
That's so great. It sounds like a lot of the things you do really empower people. And as a fitness professional myself, like a lot of it, the emphasis is on movement. So I think those are some really great tips that really empower people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually how I got into the field. I'm a certified trainer, and that's how I got into the field. Movement is medicine. And the more research we do about managing these types of symptoms, the mind and body, non-pharmacological interventions are really proven to be quite effective.
So great. So why do you think it's important that people recognize that they need professional help? And what are some of the first steps that someone should take in order to seek help, maybe from someone similar to you or even Dr. Erickson?
So I think it is incredibly important, like I said earlier, trauma processing, it doesn't happen alone. You get supportive feedback from a trained professional. What a person is sitting and thinking, and just like Dr. Stevens spoke about, their framework is different. So to sit and get help, and from a person who can help rewire their thoughts, can help them have a little more optimism, can help them recall the events in a safe manner, can help them distinguish that was then. This is not now. You are now safe. So I think it's very, very important that, you help your clients go through this healing process where they have the ability to self-regulate to the point that when the event is recalled, they're not re-experiencing those same symptoms that are so debilitating, that cause a total loss of functioning in so many areas of their life. And then I think I'd say, the first step, I think asking for help, helping people see that asking for help is a strength and not a weakness. Super, super important. And, and reducing the stigma and asking for help. So, I work with so many clients that I've taken them across that finish line of, I'm afraid to ask for help, or what are people going to think of me, or my shame or my guilt. And that's a part of really working with a trained professional that helps, reframe all that. So like you said earlier, early intervention is best. So having a person that you feel safe with, who you can say, hey, I think I need some help. And even if they can move you along that process, very important.
Yeah, definitely. So can you tell us about the different psychotherapy treatment options for both anxiety and PTSD, and maybe explain sort of how they work, especially for those who maybe have never had treatment before?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit about CBT. I mean, we talked cognitive behavioral therapy, change your thoughts, change your life, reframing. That is very, very important. So that's one modality that has proven very effective in working with trauma victims, survivors, turn thrivers. EMDR is something that has been very, very useful. And I spoke a little bit about that earlier, the bilateral stimulation. The somatic experiencing or somatic psychotherapy. I mean, that's another holistic approach that combines the body, the mind, and the spirit and the emotions in the whole healing process, using the body as a tool. So that's another great modality. And then of course, ART, and I won't repeat myself, but that's another up and coming fantastic modality with a lot of research out of UCF.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, those are really helpful to know about. You talked a little bit about the social aspect. And so how important is social support when a veteran is facing challenges with MS and either maybe anxiety or PTSD? And where can someone find maybe social support services?
So I think social support is incredibly important, particularly when we're talking about the demographic of veterans. There's so much camaraderie that goes into their experience. And I know, as a veteran myself, and I've worked in inpatient units for over a decade, and, they didn't want to hear from me until I said, listen, I'm a veteran and we don't behave this way. And this is how suddenly I had their attention and everything I said mattered. So I think it's really, really important that, veterans are with fellow veterans, or even with therapists, that they don't necessarily have to have lived experience, but just know they have some commonality regarding being a veteran, serving your country. Because believe me, within the veteran population, they have their own critiquing of each other, and that's a different story. But, yes, but working in a support group, because like I said before, this isn't something that you travel this road and you heal alone. People are in different places on their journey. They have different frameworks regarding the traumatic event and how it affected them, particularly installation of hope. When you meet other veterans within your group that have moved from a very dark place to a very light place, I love the dynamic of those kind of support groups. So I always encourage veterans or any population to get within a group dynamic.
Yeah. Where could someone find something like that, maybe in their local area?
Sure. I would look up local support groups. I'd look on Psychology Today. I know I advertise mine here in the Ocala area, but there are so many. The VA has support groups. Local hospitals have support groups. A lot of residential treatment facilities have some outpatient or partial hospitalization support groups. So those kind of areas.
Great. So Angelo wrote in that he's concerned about one of his friends who has MS and seems to have PTSD, but his friend is embarrassed to ask for help, similar to what you're mentioning. So what are some tips for how to encourage someone to get help?
I want to congratulate Angelo, because I want to remind everybody that, everyone is a counselor in some form or fashion. Mm-hmm. So, it's not always a degree that we have hanging on the wall or some great body of research. If Angelo has a friend who, he thinks is exhibiting symptoms that needs help, then be that friend, put on that counselor hat, let the friend know, then create a safe space to say, if you need to talk to someone, I'm here. And then if you need to go talk to someone, I can go with you, and just kind of walk that person over the bridge so that there's not fear or trepidation, and that they understand that really going for that help, which is out there and available. There are so many of us in this field at so many different levels. And just for Angelo, just to put that counselor hat on and say, hey, let's go, and I'll walk this walk with you until you need me no more, and he can walk independently.
Yeah, sometimes we're our friends' best advocates too, when they don't know they need some help. So I love that.
Yes.
So how does somebody know if a therapist is a good fit for them? Are there certain questions to ask? It sometimes feels like dating, I guess, when you're searching for someone to talk to.
It does. And, but just like dating, you can be with someone that's on your checklist, but their character is just not there. And you're like, no. So, it's the same thing with a therapist. And the golden rule for a therapist is do no harm, right? So one of my rules is, I always say, there's 3 strikes, you're in or you're out. So how do you know a therapist is right for you or not? It's the therapeutic rapport that you have with yourself between the therapist and the client. You can have someone who is just as brilliant as Einstein, but they just don't have that synergistic therapeutic rapport connection, which means that the therapies, it's not going to be embraced or as effective as it could be. So after 3 sessions, because sometimes people come in very guarded, particularly people who are avoiding, something that Dr. Stephen touched on that is really just so true. When you're a professional avoider, your therapist might not learn things 5, 6, or 10 sessions down the road, and they become fantastic at masking. So I say, at least at the onset, take 3 sessions to really just build the rapport, and then let the client know, I'm doing this for you. I'm here for you. This is very client-centered care. And I want to know that you feel comfortable that I'm the right provider that can help you. So ask me all the questions that you would like to have answered, and really get to know each other like 2 human beings should, and particularly in a relationship where you want to have emotional safety. And then at the end of that, if you can continue in the journey, then you're 3 sessions ahead of the game and you continue on that healing journey. And if not, then any, ethical therapist will help that client find somebody who could better assist them.
Yeah. Sounds like trust is a huge piece to that.
Yes.
Being able to trust that and make that it's a safe space. Well, Lisa, this was really helpful information, valuable information. I'm going to have you stay on because we're going to talk a little bit more about resources. So if Dr. Erickson wants to join me on screen, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the resources that we have available for our veterans. So the health and well-being of those who have served in uniform is the highest priority for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. VA provides timely access to high-quality, recovery-oriented, evidence-based mental health care that anticipates and responds to veterans' needs. In 2003, the Department of Veterans Affairs established the VA MS Centers of Excellence. The VA's MS Center of Excellence collaborate with VA providers to make sure veterans get the best care possible and have access to the various resources available within the VA. So, Dr. Erickson, I'll ask you this question. What type of treatment options and support resources are available to veterans through the VA for anxiety and PTSD?
So there's a spectrum of options. I mean, this is a national program. So across the VA, you have a range of services, ranging from counselors or psychotherapists who are, could be licensed clinical social workers, psychologists, all the way up to and including, psychiatrists who help coordinate the team and prescribe medication. So some of the services that the VA offers includes, for example, in my site is you have a clinic that's attached to primary care. It's called Primary Care Mental Health. And so if a veteran comes in to see their primary care doc and is starting to feel that their PTSD symptoms are acting up or their depression is or anxiety, they can be referred to a quick assessment in the PCMHI clinic. And so that has social workers and so forth. Psychologists and social workers, and they're part of the team. The social workers can help provide therapy as well as provide resources. And of course, on a long-term basis, you have psychologists and other psychotherapists who do the trauma work, right? The evidence-based manualized treatments, CPT and so forth, for long-term treatment that's, discreetly marked out and it's set with various goals and milestones. So it ranges from short-term, like a PCMHI clinic, to long-term therapy, but also to one-to-one family therapy. There's also group therapy for special needs, like, for example, anger or stress management or combat support. There's also group therapy for veterans who've served in combat zones or through similar traumas. So it really is a range of services.
Sounds like the VA kind of has like a comprehensive care sort of model too, where all the doctors kind of work together, which I think is really great. So that's helpful.
And I just want to add real quickly, there's even a level, a concentric circle around that, because a lot of the VA psychologists and psychiatrists are affiliated with universities and do some of the primary research to validate and improve the psychotherapy treatments too.
Oh, that's really great. So if a veteran is in crisis or someone is concerned about a veteran's mental health, what are the first steps to get help?
This is a question for me. So of course, if a person is feeling unsafe, and there's an issue right in the here and now, they can always call the crisis line like you have up there on the screen. They can call 911. They can call like their primary care doc. If it depends if they have someone in the community, but they can also call them. So that is no small thing, because I have consistently followed up with veterans who have called, for example, the crisis line. Mm-hmm. And I've heard really, really good things about it, that it's actually helpful, that it provides good resources and helps direct them to the resources that they need.
That's great. Lisa, do you have anything else to add before we move on to how the National MS Society has some resources for veterans?
No, I mean, I would definitely concur. Anybody who is, in a crisis, call the crisis hotline. They offer a wonderful service in our communities where the local VA CBOCs are located as well. So definitely that, or 911.
Okay. So in 2019, the National MS Society signed a memorandum of agreement with the Department of Veterans Affairs, MS Centers of Excellence, to improve care and expand resources for veterans living with MS and to their families. So the National MS Society's MS Navigator program provides answers to questions and access to information about all the options available to people living with MS, including veterans. So Lisa, how can someone connect with an MS Navigator?
So the MS Society has some fantastic resources. I could say that 10 times over. Definitely connect by going to the Connect with an MS Navigator, which is contact USNMSS at nmss.org. That is a fantastic resource that can just, get you connected with other resources that you need, but it's a great starting point. And then there's connection programs that you can go to the nationalmssociety.org/connections programs. Another great place to start, getting yourself connected with valuable resources. And I'm always amazed when I visit these websites because there's more resources out there and they're continually getting added that I did not know existed. So this is very valuable to have in your toolbox.
Yeah, I know that the Society has self-help groups and support groups for veterans living with MS, and some of the resources are up on the screen where you can find, a group for veterans and active duty military. And to get in touch with an MS Navigator, they can also chat or make a phone call or email. So a lot of really great ways to get involved. Oh, go for it.
Emily, I was going to say, and then of course they can watch what we're doing now, Ask an MS Expert Veterans Program.
Exactly. Yeah, these are all archived, so you can always go back and watch other topics that people may be interested in. These are really important resources, and you all have given a lot of really great information, a lot of information. So I wanted to ask what your top 3 takeaways are. Just because you shared so much valuable information. So Lisa, I will start with you. What are your top 3 takeaways with what you shared today?
Okay, so my top takeaway is take control. Take control wherever it's possible by using any of the non-pharmacological interventions I mentioned at the top of the program. Second, I would say get moving. Sweat is medicine, and it just, you can take charge of your physiology through, it's another mind-body connection. It improves your mood. It just helps you become an overcomer. And so that's my third takeaway is you have an overcomer mindset, and that's a choice, and you have to choose to overcome so that you're not overcome and you will win the battle. So those are my 3.
I love those very empowering calls to action. What about you, Dr. Erickson?
So my top takeaway would be really is a similar point about, the mind-body interactions that on the one hand, it might seem overwhelming, that mind and body connected, and in the MS, if the studies, for example, show that MS leads to anxiety, well, then does the anxiety get caught in this loop and make it worse? But the flip side is that, like you were saying, if, as Lisa said, if you take control, then instead of getting stuck, you can have this upward spiral. And so for example, smoking cessation, right, is very important, right? So a little thing like smoking, or not so little perhaps, but if you stop smoking, that'll be easier or be more helpful for your immune system. And then the person will have less acceleration of their MS symptoms. They'll have more resources to devote to their loved ones, to treatment. That in turn will lower their anxiety, and that will in turn have a lower radiological burden with the lesions and so forth. So the takeaway, I guess I would say, is that because everything is interconnected, mind-body relationships, little things over here, if you do them together in a coordinated way, can have a large effect, a massive effect in the aggregate. So that requires across the board, for you to take a coordinated approach where you don't smoke, you have the right lifestyle, you are exercising to the extent that you can, that you're engaged in treatment, that you're committed to psychotherapy, to the trauma treatment, right? So all of those things together can be very powerful, and there'll be more than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, almost like a positive ripple effect, right?
Yes, an upward spiral, absolutely.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you all sharing your expertise and being able to shed some light, especially in light of Mental Health Awareness Month. I appreciate you all being with us today. Before we close, I would like to remind everyone that you can connect with an MS Navigator via phone, email, and through the Society's website via chat. For information and resources on MS, visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates, news, self-help groups just for veterans and active duty military, more ways to get involved, and upcoming events near you, maybe even a Bike MS event like what Lisa was mentioning. To learn more about veterans and MS, visit www.nationalmssociety.org/veterans. You can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS via Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I encourage you to like and subscribe and/or get on the Society's mailing list to continue to receive up-to-date information on MS and updates on upcoming programs. Thank you again, Dr. Stephen Erickson and Lisa Lynn, for sharing your knowledge and for everyone's engagement in today's program. The recording will be made available on the Society's website at www.nationalmssociety.org/MS-expert. I invite you to join us on August 16th for our next Ask an MS Expert Veterans program. Lastly, it's important to get your feedback on today's program. You'll see a survey linked to the comment section on YouTube. By completing the survey, it helps make a difference, and it only takes 1 minute to complete. The information you provide helps continuously improve and shapes future segments. Thanks for joining us today. See you next time.